Okay. Well, I thought I'd kind of give an overview of sort of my kind of thoughts about all this, and then I'm already aware of questions from Emily and from Edith, and so, I mean, we can have more questions, but I mean, the questions that have been sent to me already kind of fit quite well, I think, with a discussion, because Emily's kind of at the beginning of planning, yeah, and Edith, I think you've got all the data, so you're at the writing. It's kind of the other end of it, isn't it? Analyzing and writing, yeah. So anyway, I think if I and also I can I think if Mick gives me, or maybe I've already got everybody's email addresses, anything that comes up in terms of suggested reading and stuff, I can send it at the end. And if there's going to be a version of this on your kind of departmental whatever website, then we can figure out how to put recommended reading up there later. Yeah. Okay.
That'd be brilliant, John. And John, sorry, I should have said at the start, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really incredibly grateful for your time.
No, it's a nice thing to do, you know, as an alternative to being locked in the house all day and never having anybody to speak to, really. So I think just I thought I'd talk about kind of very briefly background to case study research, the kind of rationale for it, principles and practicalities and so forth, just to kind of set a scene. I think that the background is that I think, I mean, case study inquiry and case study knowledge is just so basic in so many disciplines, in kind of medicine and management studies and law and so on. And I think one of the problems in psychology is that when the kind of experimentalists took over and then the kind of quantitative researchers took over, case studies got marginalized. And so we're in the process of rediscovering case studies. But I think one of the things to keep in mind about the kind of general interest across all the social sciences and humanities in case studies is that there is a massive, mainly untapped potential knowledge about how to do case study inquiry out there. If we can kind of look outside of psychology or look beyond psychology. Another thing is, I mean, my own interest, I don't know how I particularly got interested in this, but I mean, I was one of these people who was like a consumer of therapy for many years while I made a living as a psychology lecturer. It wasn't until fairly late in life that I got trained as a counsellor. And I used to teach personality psychology on a psychology degree. And I became particularly interested in Henry Murray. So Henry Murray is, I think, best known as being the co-designer of the thematic apperception technique, the TAT. And in my psychology degree, I mean, remember, I'm really old, you know, I'm kind of even much older than Mick. So this was a long time ago when I did psychology degree, and we were taught about projective techniques, and I'd always thought projective techniques were actually a pretty good thing, and I was interested in Murray. But then as I was teaching some of Murray's ideas, I became more aware that it was all based on case study research. And I managed to actually have some communication in a meeting with Murray before he died. And I think that really kind of crystallized an interest in case studies. And I think that the kind of rediscovery of case studies within psychology, and then more recently within psychotherapy research, owes a lot to Murray that's not, I think, been fully acknowledged. And then I think, there was a period when I was working in Dundee, and in Glasgow there was Mick, and there was also Robert Elliott, and there was a lot of kind of really useful collaboration going on. And Robert Elliott was really interested in case study methodology, and Robert and I managed to get a grant from the ESRC years and years ago to run a kind of seminar, a series of seminars on case study methodology with kind of big name people coming over from America and stuff. And that kind of fed into the book, which you'll be familiar with, my case study research and counselling and psychotherapy book. And I was kind of re-looking at the book in preparation for today. And I thought, yeah, that's okay. But at the time, it was really hard to write it. There was not actually that many case studies to draw upon and literature to draw upon. And since then, I've sort of constantly asked Sage if I can do a new edition, and they have not wanted me to do a new edition on basic commercial grounds that it sells about like 10 copies a year. And so anyway, so that's some of the background from my perspective. I think another thing is that I think my best research book is a book called Doing Research in Counselling and Psychotherapy. And in that, I'm basically trying to construct an argument which I don't think anybody has ever cottoned on to, because I don't think I made it clearly enough. But I think I've thought for a long time that there are kind of 5 different kinds of therapy products that people need to learn to do. So one is a literature review. Like publishable products, like a paper. You need to know what to do to produce a literature review paper. You need to know what to do some sort of outcome evaluation paper, sort of naturalistic pre-post design outcome evaluation. You need to know how to do qualitative research like grounded theory and IPA. You need to know how to do autoethnography and also case study research. And it's like, I think that one of the things that's holding us back as a discipline in terms of our relationship with research is that people get trained, people do masters and doctorates and things, and they become competent in one of these methodologies. And when they then write things, they're not drawing and publishing things. They're not drawing upon an appreciation of the other methodologies. So we may come back to this later in terms of some of the implications for that. Just let me highlight, just not to be mysterious. I think one of the implications of that is that case studies are, as we all know already, those of you who are interested in writing a case study or doing a case study, it's quite a complicated, intricate, and ethically sensitive thing to do. And it's the kind of thing that's probably easier to do later in your career when you've got cases that you might want to write up and things like that. But if you haven't had training earlier on in case study methodology, then it's very difficult to kind of know how to go about it. And in the past, I used to do quite a lot of workshops and so on case study methodology. And there'd be practitioners who would come and they would say, they'd always want to write up their own cases. but they didn't even know where to start, and they didn't know how to negotiate ethical consent and things like this. So I'm a great believer in case study inquiry being part of basic training. So the kind of rationale for, if we could move on then to the kind of rationale for doing case study research, I think that it's each methodology, like, outcome research, quantitative research, qualitative research, so on, has got its own strengths and limitations. And the particular contribution or strengths of qualitative research, the kind of distinctive thing about qualitative research is that it's good at capturing complexity. Yeah. So you're not just looking at, say, empathy. If you're looking at empathy, you're looking at how that kind of interacts with other things that are going on within the process of therapy and the therapeutic relationship. The second distinctive thing about case study research is that it allows you to look at how things unfold over time. Yeah, so that, you're looking at a case from beginning to end, and there's either stages or phases or something. There's some sort of change happening. So case studies are good at that. And the final thing is that case studies are good at kind of learning about how the context affects therapy. So if you're doing a big randomized trial, like with 100 or more clients, you can, like the school study, you can kind of say a bit about the context, but given all the other things that have to be reported and kind of measured and so on, there's not much space to write about context. But whereas when you do a case study, there's always the context completely hits you in the face, because it's like, when does the case begin and when does the case end? Is the case only about what goes on in the therapy session? Well, it's mainly maybe about that, but probably you've also got information about how the client came into therapy and how the kind of culture and society they live in are affecting the process of therapy and so on. So it's a kind of context sensitive methodology. So that's part of the rationale for it. The other rationale is that it's it kind of fits in with other things. It then slots into different kind of research tasks or different bits of a research program. So, I mean, a number of you are interested in theory building, and case study research is really good at developing theory. I won't say more about that because I'm sure we'll come back to that. But basically, interesting therapy theories are kind of complex, and like causal sequences and so on that you're interested in, and you can really get better understanding them by kind of trying to map them onto cases. I think another thing is another part of the rationale for case study research is it's practical knowledge. I mean, obviously, there's been loads of stuff written about the so-called research practice gap. Like practitioners don't read research studies. I don't particularly like the notion of the gap, but anyway, but practitioners are more likely to read case studies because the case study has got a story and it's a memorable story, and you're working with cases. So a case study lets you see, oh, here's how somebody else might have worked with a client like mine, and so forth. Another way that case study research fits in is kind of early research on a topic or hard to study topics, doing preliminary research on it. So that, for example, if you've got a new intervention or new technique, it's pretty unlikely anybody is going to give you the money or give you ethical approval to do a big randomized trial on it. But you can publish, you can analyze single cases and build up an evidence base and so forth. And then I think a kind of final way that case studies kind of fit in is this I sometimes call the double helix randomized control trial. So a randomized control trial that's got a sort of spiral of collecting the quantitative data and stuff, but then woven around is another spiral of qualitative research and case study research, which clearly is what is going on in your school study. And I think that it makes randomized trials much more kind of interpretable and kind of communicates. Like if you've got a kind of numbers, you know, a paper on your outcome results that's just full of numbers, it's fine for other researchers, but practitioners are going to think, what does this mean? But if you can present case studies, it's a good way of communicating and kind of also deepening your understanding. So these are, I think, some of the, what I would call rationale for case studies. And I think that probably not in Roehampton, because Roehampton is kind of very much, in my view, psychology and psychotherapy together. But I mean, people doing research in other types of psychology department get a hard time for wanting to do case studies. Yeah. So I think it's important to have a kind of clear rationale for how it fits in. Then I just want to say a little bit about the principles, and in chapter 2 of the case study book, there's a kind of list of principles. I can't remember if it says this in that chapter, but I have never come across a case study that fulfills all these principles. Yeah. And it's no, you just can't do it. But I would just, let me just go through what I think are the key things to be thinking about. The first thing is ethics, ethical approval, and so on. And I think that quite apart from all of the the reasons that we understand for being working ethically and confidentiality and whatever, I think another aspect of it is certainly for me and other people who I know who've done case studies, that at the end of the day, it's important to have a kind of moral confidence in what you're doing. I mean, I have case studies that I have not published because I've just not felt this is right. That even though the person has signed bits of paper saying that they give ethical consent and so forth, to me, at the point of putting it all together, it's like it's still too recognizable as somebody, like too recognizable by somebody who would know them well, and it's too sensitive and things like that. So I think the ethics are important. The second thing that's important is a rich data set. I mean, Robert Elliott's hermeneutic design has got kind of a whole kind of specification for what would be in a rich data set, interviews with a client, and quantitative process and outcome data, and so on and so forth. And I think that the more data that you've got, the more types of data that you've got, the more you're able to triangulate and come to, to have some sort confidence in conclusions that you offer. The next thing is multiple analysts, like a team approach to analyzing it, that consider multiple interpretations or multiple perspectives on the data, so that if you look at Freud's case studies, early psychoanalytic case studies, hugely fascinating, still influential, but almost entirely biased by his pre-existing assumptions and so on. And I think that we'll talk a bit more about how this happens, this sort of multiple analysts later, but I think this is a really important thing. And you can either highlight it in the way you write up a study, or it can be kind of in the background, depending on what you want to do. I think it's important to, if possible, to include the client's perspective. Most case studies published at the moment do not include the client's perspective. I mean, I read a lot of case studies, and at the end of a lot of them, I think, well, that was really interesting. That was fascinating. What did the client think? Would the client have recognized any of this that you've written about? Yeah. So I think, and of course, the interview, like an end of therapy interview, like Robert Elliott's change interview, is good. But actually, you can, if you've recorded sessions, particularly the closing sessions where you're kind of reviewing things with the client, is often like the client's version or some account from the client. And then the final kind of principle is is some sort of time series analysis. So if you go to the kind of broader case study literature in other disciplines, this is kind of what everybody does. That's a sort of common feature of case study analysis, of time series analysis, and whether you just call it like stages within the unfolding of the therapy, or whether you look for causal sequences, which is a kind of micro time series. This is kind of pretty basic thing to do. And then I've tried to kind of argue that kind of maps onto 4 different types of case study research, and they can be combined in all sorts of ways. I mean, people have research questions and research skills that allow them to combine these things in different ways. But I think it's helpful to just differentiate between kind of almost like ideal types or pure types of case study research. So one is narrative, which is based on the client's story, and usually based on interviews with clients and sometimes diaries that clients keep. And then there's the pragmatic case studies, as pioneered by Dan Fishman in his journal, Pragmatic Case Studies in Psychotherapy. And that is essentially the therapist's story. So that's the therapist saying, like, I have this approach to therapy, I have this model or conceptualization of therapy, and here's how it plays out in a case. So you can, it's a tremendously good way of communicating to colleagues, what a particular approach to therapy or model of therapy might look like. And then there's outcome-oriented case studies that are trying to answer the question, was therapy effective? Did it have a good outcome or a poor outcome in this particular case? And that is quite often linked to a kind of early wave of research. We've got a new intervention, and we want to be able to show whether it works or not. And there's kind of 2 versions of outcome-oriented therapy. There's the kind of old behavioral N=1 single subject design, and then there's the Robert Elliott's hermeneutic single case efficacy design. And the single case efficacy design is actually a really important moment in the development of psychotherapy, case study research, because the thing about it is it refers to a different logic and a different disciplinary framework, which Robert and Art Bohart also describe as judicial or quasi-judicial. So what they're saying is that you gather the evidence. So it's like a court case. You gather the evidence. And in a court case, you've got the prosecution and the defense. And in an HSCED study, you've got somebody arguing, was it a good outcome case? And somebody arguing, no, it wasn't a good outcome case. Or in that was a good outcome, had nothing to do with the therapy. And then you've got a kind of judicial process where they argue it out. Now that is, to me, that's also what Henry Murray did in the 1930s, which then got a bit lost. But that is, some version of that is, for me, how you bring in multiple analysts and multiple perspectives, right? So I've never understood why Robert only really applied that to answering the question, was it a good outcome case? Because you can equally well apply a judicial perspective to and different sort of questions of what was most helpful in that case, or does this case give support a particular theoretical model, or does it not support a particular theoretical model? So, so anyway, I'm just pausing there because within that category of outcome-oriented cases, there's a kind of methodological innovation that I think is really, really important. And then I think we've talked about theory building research. So there's these four types of research: pragmatic, narrative, outcome oriented, and theory building research. And then I'd just like to finish off by kind of highlighting what I think some of the practicalities are. In other words, when you get down to doing case study research, what are the big hurdles? I think it always takes a lot of time and effort to study a case. So you want to invest that time carefully. So you need to have a reason for choosing a case. So there's many different kind of reasons for choosing a case. And if you're, like I think some of you are, at least, if you're operating within a bigger study, you've got a reason for choosing a case, because a case would be a representative of the clients who dropped out of therapy, or a case would be a representative of clients who reported in an interview that the goals forms were really helpful for them, and then another case where the client thought that the goals forms were utter and total waste of time, and so on, right? So first thing is to kind of, sometimes you just start with a case, but it's kind of a bit more reassuring if you've got some idea of how the case fits into a kind of broader kind of population of cases. And the other thing is that it's kind of difficult to know what it's a case of until you've read the case. You see what I mean? So you can pick up a case of somebody who's dropped out of young people's therapy, and you say, right, I'm going to analyze this in terms of dropout. But when you read the case, you think it's not actually a dropout case. It's just a case of failure to communicate the decision to finish, or something like that, right? So there's always a bit of kind of Emily and I have had a bit of email correspondence about this. I think there's a bit of kind of, if at all possible, checking out on what's in the cases that might be available to you and what would be an appropriate case. Another practical difficulty is if you're doing a study where you're actually trying to set up a case series, you're actually planning to do a case series, or recruit potential cases, by which I mean asking the client at the beginning if in principle they give approval for you to do a case study, then you've always got to recruit more than you need. I mean, a few years ago, one of my PhD students at Kiel, Sophia Balamutsu, was interested in looking at metaphor in therapy cases. And I think she started off with 5 cases and ended up with 1. And I mean, this was because people got to a point of like, no, I couldn't bear anybody to be analysing this or writing about it. It's too personal and things like that. So the fact that she started off with 5 and ended up with 1 was a tribute to the authenticity of the ethical process that was going on there. But it was deeply scary for her as a PhD student. Would she have anything to write about at the end of the day, right? So that's another kind of practical difficulty. I think there are issues around writing case studies, and I think it's important to kind of to look carefully at the journal where you would be positioning your case study, where you'd be submitting your case study, because they've each got rather different structures, even if they're all journals at the moment, I would say, are interested and willing to publish case studies that are multi-method, rich data set case studies that have got some sort of rigorous, hopefully team-based system of analysis. They'll all publish things like that, but they tend to have different ideas about what the paper should look like and how long it should be and things. So that's kind of a tricky thing. I think another thing is the introduction to a case study paper is sometimes a trick. We'll come back to that later, but it's say, for example, that you're publishing a case study of a young person who's dropped out of therapy. So you can, there's a literature on that in your introduction of, how many clients. I mean, there's a massive literature on dropout therapy to start with, and then there's a sub-literature on young people dropping out of therapy, and then there's maybe some studies at least, on interviews with young people. But and you can kind of do all that, but at the end of the day, your argument is then to really understand this phenomenon, we've got to look at it at case-by-case level. And at that point, what are you saying? Are you saying this is the first case study ever on that? Or are there other case studies? And that's painfully difficult to establish because case studies are, to actually search the literature on that. And then there's the question of how you would assemble a research team and how a research team would function. But I got a feeling we're going to come back to that in relation to possibly what Emily's planning to do, or maybe Edith as well. So anyway, these are some kind of opening remarks of probably stuff you all know already, right? but you've heard me say it now. So, so Mick, are you going to facilitate this a bit? So we could either go into kind of what Edith's questions that she's already thought about and Emily's questions, or we could open it up to other questions. What do you?
I think that's fantastic, John, and you know, you're saying that people already know that, but that's the clearest, the most coherent introduction to case studies I've heard is brilliant. What I suggest is let's just open it up to questions and dialogue. Whoever wants to go first, Emily or Edith, or really whoever has got questions. I think it's just raised so much. I'm sure we've got about just over 45 minutes. So
yeah, okay.
Who'd like to go first? Emily.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I had a question just about ethics. So I think it was just, so you can alter the characteristics of the client to kind of disguise who they are when you're describing them. But I suppose I was also thinking, do you have any suggestions for trying to disguise the results? And I know it might be quite difficult because they are probably including results for direct quotes from what young people have said. So yeah, do you have any suggestions for how that part of the results could be disguised in some way, or what to think about, I suppose?
Well, I think that I think it's really important to take it very seriously. Yeah. I think that it's important to have ethical consent, traditional ethical consent, like an informed consent form and an information sheet and things like that. As you would in any research, yeah. But the trouble with that is that when somebody consents for their data to be included in a study of multiple participants or then their own individual story gets hidden, doesn't it? So it's numbers, it's hidden in a big data set. But even quotes are short quotes, like participant 1 or participant 2 and things like that. And they don't really, you can edit them so that the kind of contextualizing and individual kind of identifiable things are not in there. But when you're doing a case study, then you are, it's a whole storyline, isn't it? And even little quotes of, that session where we talked about goals was the most helpful thing in the whole therapy. I mean, that's like an innocuous statement, but actually within the whole story, it might make it just that little bit more identifiable and personal and things like this. So the best thing is to get permission, is to ask the client to read the case study and get their permission. Are you okay about this, right? But and I've tried that, and it's actually I'm not. I think there are some situations where there's been some sort of collaborative process about creating the case analysis and things that's involved the client, where that's kind of a kind of easy next step. But I haven't really had that situation. And to kind of go back to the client out of the blue several months later, after they've filled in the initial thing, say, by the way, I'm going to write up your story in detail. Would you have a look at it? It's a bit intrusive in itself. Yeah. So I think that's probably not a good thing to do unless, there's a kind of style of research that's very much, working with service users and clients and things. But if you're not doing that, then maybe it's too intrusive to go back. So the other thing I would say is to have somebody independent just read it as an ethical consultant.
Okay.
Right. And actually, I would go further than that and say, even if the client has given permission, or they've read the paper, I would still bring in an ethical consultant because, and I think there's examples of this in my case study book, of a client will say, I want everybody to know about how I overcome my childhood sexual abuse and things like that. And publish it. I want everybody to know about this. I want my voice to be heard. But they don't know, they don't really have a sense of what the public impact of that might be. And it's one of our jobs is to kind of look after them. Yeah. And I think that as the researcher, say you or Mick as the kind of principal researcher, you've got too much of an interest in publishing the case, right? So it's a matter of finding somebody else in the department and just saying, just go through it as if you were an advocate for the client and tell me what you think about this. Yeah. So that would be my advice.
Right.
I think one of the things in the emails I sent you was to encourage you to read case studies.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not right now because you're obviously doing your proposal and things, but one of the things to look for when you're reading case studies is the ethics.
Okay.
You can just skim case studies, look at the ethics bit, and there isn't a standard practice, right? Going back to the thing about a little bit more about disguising the client. Something that I thought I might talk about at the end, if we've got some time, is about case study meta-analysis. Yeah, and I'm working with a colleague. We're interested in what integrative therapy actually is. Okay, so we decided to collect up all the published case studies of integrative therapy and do a meta-analysis of different forms of psychotherapy integration. Yeah. And I was talking to somebody about this and I said to her, oh, we've included your case study. Yeah. And she said, oh, that's interesting. So she said, how are you analyzing all these case studies? And I said, well, we're starting off by just listing, the ages of the clients, their gender and, what their presenting problem was and things. And then we're looking at the model of integration and stuff like that. And she starts to laugh. And I said, what's going on? And she said, well, to disguise that client, I changed their sex. Right? So, I mean, I'm just saying this is kind of, you change the occupation, you change where they might live, but sometimes you would change things like that because in a sense, the kind of scientific guts of the paper is some sort of therapy process that you're analyzing. You see what I mean? And to keep the client safe, which is the primary responsibility that we all have, to work as ethically as we can. Sometimes you may have to sacrifice other things. Yeah. So you may have to sacrifice demographic information. You may have to sacrifice, there may be an absolutely wonderful description of a change episode in therapy, but it's too personal. So you can't include that. You've got to find another one that's not as powerful. See what I mean? So I think I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the sort of choices that are around. Does that kind of make sense?
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Next question.
Next question. I mean, it can be either general questions about case studies or specific to. I've got loads, but I want to give other people space. Jasmine.
Yeah, hi John. My name's Jasmine. Sorry that I was late this morning.
Okay, yeah.
9, but I couldn't get there for 9. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of questions really, and apologies if you've already kind of touched on this and I missed it. I'm an IPA researcher predominantly in thematic analysis, so I don't know if you've these studies, but one of my tutees, Claire, who's here, we were discussing what actually constitutes a case, and is there any way that a setting could be considered as a case? So, and how that might work. So, for example, an IAP service, for example, could be the case, or but I don't know what data would necessarily look like. But maybe the participant interviews or the transcripts. Well, I don't know how that would work exactly, but we were thinking about a particular interest in the setting being seen as the case, so the charitable organisation or the IAP service or the, well, whatever. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's a much bigger, I mean, compared to, like in my book, the case study research book, it's all about therapy cases, you know, a client seeing a therapist. And I was aware that there was a much bigger literature on organizational cases. And I didn't want to muddy the water, so I just kept that out. But I would bring that in to a new edition of the book. And in fact, my wife and I, we're working on a case study of a training course as a case. So our rationale is that the literature on therapy training is very fragmented and kind of not particularly helpful. And our argument is that actually the use of a training intervention, say like a personal development group, an experiential group for students, it doesn't make any sense to just study that on its own, or it does, but actually to understand what's going on, you need to see it in the context of the university course. So I don't know, we've not submitted it yet, so maybe journals will just throw it out, but I completely agree, and I think that there are, I think that studies of therapy clinics or agencies or IAP centres or whatever it's going to be, voluntary sector counselling organisations, is really, really timely, because there's been a couple of, I don't know if this is where you're coming from on this, but there's been a couple of studies and reviews, 2 or 3 studies or reviews, some of them actually using IAP data, that have found that, I mean, like David Clark, you know, I'll better be careful what I say about David Clark, but anyway, the founder of IAP, I think, believed that all the research on IAP would show that CBT was better than everything else. Yeah. This did not come to pass. And what his most recent analyses of like thousands and thousands of IAP clients is that some IAP centres do much better than others, even when you factor in kind of demographic characteristics of the population in that area and things like that. Social deprivation, health problems and things like this. But that's as far as he's got. And there's very few studies of what is going on in, say, for example, IAP centres that are getting great results versus ones that are not getting great results. Is this what you're interested in?
Well, we were thinking about disclosure of suicide, and that in some charitable organisations that, hi Claire, that they have a very different confidentiality agreement and kind of non-disclosure, and that encourage the disclosure of suicide. So it's more around that actually. Thinking about that being a very bespoke setting. So I think Samaritans historically had that, and then they had to change it. But Claire's working at a different charity at the moment, and just seeing that as a very kind of a bespoke it's bespoke for the setting really. So whether how you would negotiate that within a case study set design.
The classic book is Robert Yin, Y-I-N, Case Study Methods or something like that. It's on its umpteenth edition, published by Sage, and I don't think it's got like therapy research in it or therapy clinics or anything, but it's just full of examples of that kind of thing. Organizations, how do different organizations, how are they kind of does the organizational culture, the procedure, the hierarchical aspects of it, how does that affect the way they do different things? I mean, endless studies of schools and so on like that. So there's a big literature, but Yin kind of condenses it all into kind of, here's some options for how to design a study like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
John,
I've made a note. There's a woman in America called Joan Cook, who was interested in, she's a kind of trauma therapist, and she was interested in why some services in America embraced EMDR and others didn't. You know what I mean? So she had a case study design where she had one case of a clinic that had really trained everybody in EMDR, another clinic that EMDR was the work of the devil and they weren't going to have anything to do with it. And you know what I mean? So I think this is a really helpful kind of research.
We'll look a bit more deeply. Thank you very much.
John, can I bring you, thanks Jasmine. John, can I bring you on to the topic of combining different methods and kind of case study methods? Because I think that's one question that a lot of people working on case studies here have, is particularly, I guess, if you're asking a question like you're wanting to test a particular model or look at a particular theory around why people drop out or how school-based counselling is working, or whether goals are important. Is it legitimate to combine, say, theory-building case studies with narrative case studies, or should people be sticking to just one method?
I don't know if I don't know if it is a method. You see what I mean? I don't know. I'm very uncertain about the difference between words like method and methodology and approach and things like that. But if we can be specific, right. If you take theory building case research, the clearest example, the best example we've got of theory building case research is Bill Stiles's endless studies on the assimilation model, right? So Bill's argument is that you need to have data that's relevant to the theory, and you need to be able to analyze that data in relation to the concepts of the theory. So he's got his assimilation coding scheme and things like that. So you have a case, all you need is recordings of sessions, and then you can apply the kind of assimilation analysis and so forth. Now, in most of these cases, and most of the papers that have been produced out of that, there's a very thin narrative, right? The story of what was going on for the client is very briefly described, okay? And in the earlier papers they did, the story of the client's experience, and to some extent the therapist's experience, were a bit more in the foreground. But as they got more and more focused on sort of like the minutiae of the theory that they were testing out case by case, they kind of lost some of that, and it became very much this sort of conceptual, working at this sort of conceptual level with the case material. So that's one example. Another example would be there's at least three cases by Clara Hill and 2 cases by her group and 1 case by somebody else inspired by them on immediacy in therapy, which are sort of beautifully described and analysed multi-method case studies. And Clara she came up with this idea, which is, I think, such a good idea. She said, well, we all talk about immediacy, but what is immediacy? There's hardly any literature on immediacy. So let's just see what happens in cases. So these cases are, I've got a lot of analysis of immediacy episodes, where the therapist is talking about, this is what I feel now, that sort of thing, in the transcript, and kind of clients' ratings of these episodes and things like that. But at the same time, you can, in each of these cases, if you're not particularly interested in the technical analysis of immediacy, you can read it as an immediacy story. You can get the client's experience. It's a kind of, there's enough narrative woven through it. And then a third example would be the paper by Quinn, can't remember her first name, published in Psychotherapy Research a few years ago. So she was interested in therapy with people who'd had men who had seizures, psychogenic seizures, like epileptic seizures, but weren't epilepsy. And this is a horrifically difficult thing. I mean, it messes up your whole life. And you go around all the hospital consultants and none of them can help you. So you end up seeing a psychotherapist. So she said, well, what happens in these therapies? So she interviewed 3 clients and their therapists. So it was a narrative study. The whole thing is kind of rich narrative of their stories and so forth. But then at the end, there's a kind of thematic interpretation of the key features of these stories, which she puts forward as the beginnings of a theory of therapy for people with psychogenic seizures, right? So I'm just saying that in my view, theory building it can be mixed in these different ways, yeah. And if one of the tiles on the screen was Bill Stiles, he would probably disagree with that, because he believes in a very kind of pure kind of theory building research, which is, I know why he's arguing that, because he doesn't believe that within the psychotherapy field we're taking theory seriously enough. And if we did take theory seriously enough, this is what we do. We do what he does. But I'm just saying, well, that isn't really going to work for everybody. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So I think it's then a matter of thinking, what kind of paper would I like to produce? Or, given the data I've got. I mean, for example, my guess is that this is probably Emily's research, isn't it? That the interviews with young people are not going to be as rich as Quinn's interviews with these men who'd had psychotherapy in Australia for psychogenic seizures. So you're not going to be able to do something like that. You're going to have to do something else along with it. You're going to have to analyze the transcripts, because this is the other big source of evidence that you've got, isn't it? Well, you've got the measures, but you've got the transcripts, and there must be fascinating clues in the transcripts of the client's ambivalence about therapy, or whether the therapist is picking these up or not. Who knows? Yeah. So it's going to be more like a Clara Hill study. Do you know what I mean? It's going to be some narrative, but some other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could say otherwise, if you do 3 of your clients and produce an analysis of 3 fairly thinly, shortish interviews, journal reviewers are going to say, well, this is like a half-baked qualitative study. Yeah. Why don't you just have, what happened to, clearly you've got a load of other interviews with clients that have dropped out. So why don't you just analyze them? So if you want to do, so I'm just saying, I think my understanding of, what's available to you is probably going to be the Clara Hill type, bit of both. Yeah.
That's so helpful, John.
Yeah.
I don't know whether somebody maybe working with the ethos data or Sophie would like to kind of talk a little bit about what they're specifically thinking of doing, just to get John's maybe kind of concrete views on how you might go about doing that. Jess, for instance.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So I'm looking at doing a theory building case study. I don't have any interviews, unfortunately. It's with 2 young people on the spectrum with ASD. And one of my questions, I suppose, was around kind of the initial overarching metaphor or theory, in that I want it to be very much related to kind of the humanistic base of the counselling, but also I want to try and incorporate theory around kind of autism and social emotional processing difficulties or differences, and sense of self, and to make it relevant to that population and to represent that, I suppose. And I suppose my question is, would you be able to combine, maybe from your point of view, kind of merge those or theories together in a sense? Yeah.
Well, what data do you have?
So I have the session recordings for each of the young boys. So it's around, I think, 10 to 12 sessions each. And it is quite rich in kind of what's coming out. And there are definitely elements which appeal to something which is more autism specific, but also I can see kind of the benefit of the humanistic approach for them within that, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. I just don't know whether it would be feasible to do that, or whether that would be kind of against the more purist theoretical standpoint which you were describing.
Yeah. So what the way you're talking about that, it's like there's somebody going to criticize what you're doing. I'm not quite sure why would they, what are you kind of arguing against here? I'm not quite clear what your concern is.
So I suppose, yeah, I suppose my concern is that with kind of coming in with something that is theory based, and having that kind of metaphor, I suppose. Does it need to be something that's concrete, or I feel like going in with kind of already kind of combining those two ideas and like around the school-based humanistic counselling and something that's more ASD specific, that would already be kind of going in with that kind of bias and assumption. Obviously I have listened to the recordings, but I don't know, I think
okay. I think that the I don't know if I'm understanding you correctly. I think what you're describing is, I think, one of the kind of fundamental tensions in qualitative research. And if you compare it, let's just say you compare it with how a quantitative researcher, you sound to me like a qualitative researcher, yeah. But if you think just briefly what a quantitative researcher might do, right? I mean, this is purely hypothetical, right? But a quantitative researcher with a humanistic background might say that that what they would be interested in is they'd want to measure something, wouldn't they? So what could you measure that would be relevant to a humanistic understanding of these cases in terms of the transcript? You could measure experiencing level, yeah, and you could measure kind of adequacy or level of empathic responding, yeah. So you've got coding systems for that, so you can work your way through the transcript and code it for that, and you could have an independent coder. You do interreliability and things like this, yeah. And so you'd have some quantitative data, yeah. So if we just put that to one side, a qualitative researcher is wanting to be more open, yeah, you know, more kind of discovery oriented. But a qualitative researcher still has some ideas in their head about things, yeah. So I think there's many ways of dealing with this. One is to, at one end, I would say one end of a continuum would be phenomenological research, where you try to bracket off what's in your head and your assumptions and keep asking what is happening here, and kind of describe. So you get this sort of hugely rich description of things, yeah. And on the other end of the scale is would be something like Clara Hill's consensual qualitative research, where you decide on things you'd be interested in, domains that you'd be interested in, yeah. So Clara Hill, faced with your cases, might say, well, empathy is kind of interest, because somebody on the autism spectrum, it might be difficult to be empathic with them. It might be difficult for them to appreciate your empathic response to things. So from a consensual qualitative research, you'd say, right, let's look at the transcript and identify all the episodes within the therapy that are somehow empathy episodes, right? But then to look at them with an open mind, yeah? To be kind of, you know, to have a research team and have different perspectives on it and things, and just see what's there, you know, to be more like a phenomenologist. So, I mean, years ago, I was really interested in narrative ideas about therapy and so forth. and I did some case studies of therapy transcripts. And I didn't describe it like this at the time, but basically I was interested in how the client told their story. Yeah. So I would read through and I'd just make notes in the margin about this seems to be this kind of mode of storytelling. And this is, you know, this is a story that's got lots of metaphors in it. And I would gradually sort of chunk the transcript into episodes that I would then try and think, these episodes, there's a different type of episode as we go through. You see, there's a shift in the therapy. So that's there's many different ways of doing that. Yeah. But
I think stick to one specific kind of.
Well, I think the sticking to the one specific thing. You mean like that sort of qualitative analysis that I was describing?
I meant kind of one kind of clear theory.
Yeah.
It does that.
Wait, I haven't finished. There's another option in this. I think the other option is kind of doing a kind of variant of interpretative phenomenological analysis, right? And I really like IPA, and I think what IPA does is allow you to be a phenomenologist and describe things. Say, like, this is what I looked at the material, and this is what hit me, and this is what seemed to be there. But it allows you to go to town on theoretical interpretation of it as well. So basically, to me, at least, in an IPA paper, the findings or results section is a lovely kind of thematic description of what was there, say, in the interviews. And then in the discussion section, the author or authors can kind of they've kind of, that's the space where you say, oh, this is how it relates to humanistic ideas. This is where it relates to theories of autism and stuff like that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I think okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's been really helpful. Thank you.
I've got some more. What other question? I've got a few other questions I think seem central, but Sophie, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of doing theory building case studies, we've had discussions in supervision about having a research question or not. I know some case studies don't, and theory building case studies, I know Bill Stiles writes that, you know, you shouldn't necessarily have a research question because what you're doing is testing the theory. But we've sort of landed on a kind of having a research question is just about testing the theory as a kind of focus. But I guess, I just wanted to ask what your thoughts were on that.
Well, go on. What is your research question?
So how does goal-oriented practice impact therapeutic change? So it's about testing the theory that goal-oriented practice impacts therapeutic change. That's the theory that I'm going to be testing.
Right. I would push you more on that. Yeah. And I think Bill Stiles has forgotten that there was a time when the assimilation model didn't exist, right? So there was a time when he and David Shapiro and others were sitting there with these cases from the Sheffield psychotherapy study and thinking, what is going on? how do we understand the process of change? So they didn't have an assimilation model, and then they came up with an assimilation model. But before they formulated the assimilation model, they had ideas, right? And so this is where I would push you. I mean, not now, I'm not trying to put you on the spot now in this meeting, but to maybe think about this later, is if you, it's almost like it's similar to researcher reflexivity, right? What are your pre-existing assumptions? What are your pre-understandings that you have? So what would be your kind of implicit or rough and ready or preliminary theory of how goals conversations and goals forums and so on operate? Yeah, right. And because that is, and I think it's worth spending a lot of time on that, right? Because then when you're faced with the horrific complexity of the cases, you've got a list of things, right? So, I mean, here would be this would be an example from me, right? Because this is something that is, I'm genuinely interested in, right? I believe in goals forums, yeah, and that the client, the process of formulating a goal and then having a weekly conversation of some type about goal is facilitative, right? So my model would be that goals talk of some kind, around the goals forum, would lead to some kind of new understanding event or closer mutuality, connection, connectedness sort of thing, right? So I'd be looking for that. But the thing that really intrigues me is Hannah Oldley's research from Norway, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like completely the opposite. It's like therapists who have very subtle goals, agency-oriented conversations. So maybe then part of my theory would be, well, that is helpful. Mm. So is there things as described with Oldley's research that's visible in the case? Yeah. And then how do these fit together? Is it possible, and this is kind of hard, but if you could answer this, I'd be really interested in it. Does the fact that in the sample you've got, the cases you've got, that there is this formal goals conversation, does that seem to inhibit these other sorts of things that Audley is describing? Yeah. So anyway, that's just the beginnings of a preliminary theory of goals. Mm. Yeah. And if you have that beside you as you and colleagues hopefully are analyzing the cases, then you can look for these things and you can say, no, that's stupid, that doesn't turn up anywhere, right? Or it needs to be phrased in a different way or defined in a different way. Or really exciting, here's something that wasn't in our previous discussions that's like here and in the data, and it's a surprise. And I think that, let me give you, we're kind of running out of time a bit, but let me give you another example, of something which I don't think there's enough attention to, and I've got my ideas about that. But if you look at the task analysis research by mainly Les Greenberg and Pasquale Leone and people like that in Canada, and the trouble with it, it's kind of embedded within the wonderful world of emotion-focused therapy and things. So other people are not paying enough attention to it. But one of the things you're looking at is a sort of goal clarification task, you could say, right? But if you think about how they're not looking at that sort of task. They're looking at other tasks like exploring an unclear felt sense and things, right? But their starting point is they all sit around the table and think, right, just on the basis of our experience as therapists, what do we think the task sequence is going to look like? So they get a kind of a priori starting point, and then they look in, quantitatively and qualitatively at task episodes, and see whether that's valid or not. And you see anyway, you see what I'm getting at?
I think so. Is it about sort of having, you have the theory as a starting point, but you pick out also your own assumptions based in the theory, and you kind of test, it's almost like you have a specific set of assumptions that you're testing, and also looking at if there's something that's not in that comes up in the data. Am I?
Yeah, right? Absolutely. I think to me, one of the kind of deeply sad aspects of psychotherapy research, more and more in recent years, is it's not discovery oriented. Yeah. And in other words, people have a theory or they measure things, and that's all you get. And I'm thinking, this is not real. And I'm thinking, any research that I've done, I've always learned such a lot, because you've got to really immerse yourself in something and really engage in it. So I think that it's really important to have that space for just kind of new insights. Yeah. I think, anyway.
John, can I sneak in one last question before we finish? Just because I think it's a really important one, and you mentioned it a few times. It's about teams. You've talked about kind of working as a team, but everybody here is pretty much doing research within a doctorate, where getting together a kind of big team where more than one person can work on the analysis in depth is probably going to be fairly limited. So what are the concrete, I know you mentioned a bit about judges, but can you say a little bit more about concrete ways in which people can bring in that triangulation within the context of a doctoral study?
Right. Okay, we're going to have to finish after this because I've got to go off. Right, but if we'll just have another 3 or 4 minutes. Right. The first thing is that if you don't have a team, if you don't have other people looking at it, you're going to miss things, right? So I've got a case which I've done workshops with around the world, many workshops, different groups of therapists and trainees and things like this, and which I give people the case materials and get them to kind of work in teams on it. And every time I do that, new insights into the case come up. So I am 110% convinced that a solo analysis is going to miss things. And I think one of the big mistakes in the HSCED group at Strathclyde, I think I know why they've done this, but the original HSCEDs that Robert did had teams, right, separate affirmatives and skeptic teams who have battled away. And now it's like one student does an affirmative analysis and does a skeptic analysis, all from within their own head. It's not nearly as convincing and rich and so forth. So I am absolutely this is not just kind of Bakhtinian dialogical bullshit. This is like my personal experience of kind of a dialogical approach to this really makes a difference. So at the moment, there's 3 basic models of this. I'm also convinced that you need a framework if you're going to do this at all. When I was working in Oslo, we worked on several case studies, and nobody would kind of follow my ideas of having a structure. And we spent bloody months on these things that didn't need to take months, right? So a structure helps you to make use of your time. So there's three models. One is the HSCED model of all these things. You start with a case book. All the data is in a big book, right? Which everybody's got the same thing, like transcripts of sessions, measures, interviews, whatever. So in the HSCED, you've got maybe 2 or 3 people, or maybe just a couple of people that are the affirmatives and skeptics. They read this, and then they present the argument of here's why it's good outcome case, here's why it's poor outcome case, and you kind of glower at each other. This can be very dramatic and fun and competitive and things. You go away and each group says, we're going to show these bastards they're wrong, so they have a rebuttal and so on. And then you have a judge or judges who look at all this and say, right, on the basis of what the affirmatives and the skeptics have said, this is what, we think we've got like a 75% confidence that it's a good outcome case or whatever. And you can weave in there like what were the helpful factors in the therapy. It doesn't have to be just an outcome question. But now I have done that in a meaningful way. And at Abertay, they do this every year in a meaningful day, in a one-day workshop, right? Where all this happens in a day and you go back and forwards, things like this. I mean, clearly at the moment, we can't have workshops like that, can we? So it's got to be kind of online and things. So that's one model. And then in a model like that, the fellow students are the co-analysts and somebody like Mick or me is the judge. Yeah. I think you mentioned this in an email, Mick. You can't, I think to have a professor as a co-analyst alongside you is like not a good use of the professor's time, and also introduces power dynamics, which is, are not going to be there if it's just colleagues, side by side, arguing about the material or discussing material. But then somebody else is the ultimate judge. Interestingly, there's been a couple of experiments where the judges have been lay people, and lay people are actually able to make a decision about this, but whether, which analysis is more convincing. So that's that. A version of that is Clara Hill's consensual qualitative research, where you don't have, it's not quasi-judicial, you've got a group working on things. So you say to them, like, what are the helpful processes, or what's the change process within this case? Or how do you make sense of this case in terms of humanistic ideas, or what is useful or not useful goal or exploration process, whatever questions. So the questions are decided, the group works on this, and the professor or some other person is the auditor of that. So it's similar kind of hierarchical thing. The group works on it and then presents the findings to somebody else who says, yeah, this kind of makes sense, you've arrived at, this looks good, or I'm not convinced by that, could you take that back again, have another look at it. And then the third version is a bit weird, but works tremendously well. It's called the Ward method. Bill Stiles came up with the Ward method, and Kate Smith at Abertay did a case study based on the Ward method. So again, you have a case book, and you decide on the questions you want answered. And say, I was involved in this study with Kate Smith. There was 3 of us. So we each went away with the case book, with questions, came back, and we presented our each individual analysis of the case, right? And the others just sat and listened. no conversation about it. You just listen and you take notes and things. And then you go away and you produce another analysis of the case in which you take account of the other perceptions, you know, the other members of the team, and you come back and you've converged a bit because you've heard the other views. And usually we just had 3 iterations of that, and we arrived at something that we were happy with. And Ward, the Ward method is a New Zealand architect who said, this is the way his architectural practice designs buildings. They each come up with a different design. They just present the design to each other. They listen to each other, go away, come back a week later with another design and things like this. And it's a bit strange to do it because it's very disciplined. You don't have any kind of side discussions about the meaning of therapy and whatever else. You just get on with it. So at the moment, I would say there's these 3 main versions of it. And the other thing that I would say, just kind of maybe the final point about these, is the team then includes the principal investigator, you know, whoever's going to write it up, say, sort of Emily with her cases. And they are almost certainly doing more work than the other members of the team because they've got more at stake, and they're drawing it all together. Yeah. And I think it just has to be like that. I've never seen it operate as a sort of complete kind of democratic thing because it's just the realities of life is you need somebody to be the coordinator and finally produce a written version of it. But during the dialogue and during the discussion, there isn't a sort of difference between people. It's like everybody's ideas are equal. That's it.